Welcome back, and welcome to the ULEV session. The concurrent panel on the other track is international trade. We've had some questions from the audience already, but please do feel free to submit them anytime during this conversation using the question form below this window. Joining me this morning are Sascha, Peter and Glenn from IVECO, Nissan and BMW respectively, all companies among the pioneers and still among the leaders in this field of ULEV. So I'm sure our expert guests will have plenty of valuable insights to share on this theme, as well, of course, as answers to your questions. Before I start the conversation with our panel, though, we recorded them last week to get a few insights into their view of the key and current ULEV trends.
I think a green agenda was actually driving the automotive industry prior to the crisis. But one thing that we are seeing is that the COVID-19 crisis really accelerates change. And I think that the green development in the automotive industry will certainly be accelerated.
The commercial vehicle industry is since ever focused on reducing emissions, simply because CO2 emissions correspond to fuel consumption, and fuel consumption is for our customers is typically the most important cost over lifetime.
I think there was a strong focus on net zero even before we went into lockdown, and I think that's only going to continue as a society we appreciate the cleaner air and the quieter streets that we've experienced.
The new normal, I think, is the power of choice. Customers now have the opportunity to choose between fully electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, as well as efficient conventional vehicles.
Although our latest research shows that an impressive 77% of buyers are considering a ULEV for their next car, unfortunately, we're a way off being able to claim that electric is the new normal from a consumer point of view. To make that sort of breakthrough, we need to move from our current status of high consideration into one of high conversion and transaction.
The focus and the growth in last mile delivery that we've seen as a result of the lockdown offers a real growth opportunity, as 100% electric vehicles, electric vans, are a great option for last mile delivery. And the other growth opportunity that we see is also in e-taxis.
But in the long term, we see fuel cell technology based on hydrogen being dominant on long-haul truck distribution. And in the meantime, we as IVECO, we definitely see natural gas, methane, or even biomethane being the transition technology for the next 10 to 15 years until finally we come to fuel cell hydrogen on long haul and probably battery electric applications in the more city-like environment.
And we're not likely to see a real step change in that trend until the price of EVs comes down. That remains consumers' number one concern when buying an EV, as with almost any car.
If we look at sales in a European context, our prediction is that in 2021, next year, 1 in 4 vehicles sold by the BMW Group in Europe will have a plug. 4 years later, by 2025, that share will go up to 1/3. And in the direction of 2030, about 50% of the vehicles, the new vehicles that we sell in Europe, will be electrified.
We believe that 2020 will be the year of acceleration where we go strongly forward to decarbonize the transportation industry.
So I think overall, the message I have is one of positivity. I think we can see the road ahead, the road to net zero, and we want to drive it.
Sascha, Peter, Glenn, welcome and good morning to you all. I now have the impossible challenge of following on from Justin Webb, but I'm sure I can count on you guys to make this an interesting and useful debate. So I'll get right on with it, starting with Peter, if I may. You mentioned in that video clip there was already a strong focus on net zero even before lockdown, and it looks set to continue. But to what extent should automotive sector recovery actually be driven by a green agenda post-COVID?
Good question, and glad to see you're filling in the shoes. I mean, I think the industry was already moving in that direction, and I think as you flagged in your intro piece, consumers are also looking and considering electric vehicles for their next vehicle choice. But I think in terms of accelerating that that transition, I think there is a real opportunity coming out of COVID-19 to push the agenda around net zero. And I think that's going to need three things. I think that's going to need continuing support for consumers to switch to electric through continued incentives. I think it's going to need continued investment into the charging infrastructure. And finally, I think it's going to need support for manufacturing as we transition out of making internal combustion engines into electric vehicles. So I think there's a real opportunity and we need to seize that.
But just looking at the forward views that are out there, lots of differing opinions. Can you give us your own outlook for this year, despite the disruption of economic activities and so on caused by the epidemic?
I think for us, it is a very difficult time. But one of the things we have seen is that sales of electric vehicles have continued to be positive even during the lockdown period. And I think there are going to be some exciting new product launches coming on this year. That means the sector, as we come out of this difficult period, I think you are going to see more activity around ultra-low emission vehicles, not least because of the product offerings that manufacturers are going to be coming forward with.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So, Sascha, sorry, I was trying to bring you in there on that view of the outlook for this year as well. Have you got an opinion on how things are heading, where we're looking?
Yes, we definitely see acceleration, as we said. It's still on a relatively low basis. So if we discuss electric or hydrogen at this stage, we talk about few units. But if we talk about gas, what at this moment is the only, let's say, viable alternative, it's methane. So it's the lowest carbon fuel that we have if we don't go to electric. There we see the industry probably having a registration of 3%. And for IVECO, it's more or less 15% of our estimated sales this year. So definitely for us, it's overrated. And the industry is growing at this stage more or less one small percentage point per year. So we started 3 years ago, more or less. So we are 3%, and we see that tendency a bit getting accelerated now by the COVID effects.
Okay, thanks for that. And Glenn, you commented just now that around 50%, I beg your pardon, of the vehicles you sell in Europe will be electrified by around 2030. But continuing down that road to zero that we're all on, if the government's 2035 policy proposal is to become reality, what support measures need to be put in place?
Right, I mentioned that in my opening remarks as well, that over the next 10 years to 2030, our prognosis is that about half of our new vehicle sales will consist of electrified vehicles. So these will be vehicles with a plug, so either plug-in hybrid electric vehicles or fully electric vehicles. I think in order to ramp that up, there are 3 points that are very key. One is clearly in our domain in terms of being a car manufacturer, improving the range of our vehicles, making the product spectrum attractive. By 2023, we want to have 25 electrified vehicles on the market. So having that range, and I think that's really an industry trend. Car makers have attractive products that are real value proposition for customers. Next to that, the charging infrastructure is very key. This was already mentioned, but there's a lot of focus on public charging infrastructure. But I think the private charging infrastructure is one thing that we shouldn't forget. 80% of all charging is done either at home or in a work environment place. So we want to improve accessibility. This applies also to plug-in hybrid electric vehicles because they really you increase the electric driving through the access to charging. That is one key fundamental point. And beyond that, there's also financial support. And now that we're entering the recovery phase and coming out of crisis mode, there are a lot of support schemes that are picking up that encourage the uptake of electric vehicles. And I think one point that's very encouraging for all of us is that despite the fact that we see that demand is going down for cars around the world because of the crisis shock,
share of electrified vehicle concepts is relatively stable. In some markets, it's even increasing. So that means electric mobility is a robust trend, and I think that's the comforting news, that we will be seeing increased sustainable uptake of electric vehicles over the years.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. I agree with you completely. That's definitely a source of optimism. And from a commercial vehicle perspective, Sascha, what are you expecting from the UK government in that regard to accelerate the market introduction of low carbon solutions and infrastructure in your market?
Yeah, we definitely need support if we want by 2040 to have more or less carbon-free transport emissions. That means that starting from 2030, so in 10 years' time, a big portion of the running park must be transformed. So we must have a lot of zero-emission vehicles already on the road in 10 years' time. So as manufacturers, we are working on the technology, and I would say within the next 5 years, the technology is available in all facets and for all applications. Then the big question is the commercial viability. The commercial vehicle industry and logistics is a very price competitive industry. So in terms of total cost of ownership on a period of 3 to 5 years, there must be a value proposition that the battery, gas or hydrogen trucks are comparable, or let's say even have an advantage in terms of total life cycle cost. We are there on the gas with the incentives that the government has put in place. The infrastructure is building up, and we will have to do the same on electric, battery electric, and on fuel cell. I think it's still a little bit too early to come up with concrete measures, but with the technology coming into maturity and customer interest really growing, I hope that we will find also in the UK a tax incentive scheme or something that is going on the kilometers run based on the reduced CO2 emissions that will bring those new technologies on an equal playing field with the current diesel technology.
Absolutely.
Just as an example, Germany, for example, has just extended basically motorway toll where heavy duty trucks are running. This is a very strong incentive on the national roads, especially for transit countries. But there are multiple ways of effectively incentivizing customers to make that switch, and then also for the infrastructure and charging industry to build up.
No, totally. So sticking with that view then around the kind of partnership that's required to progress EV adoption. Peter, if I can come back to you, your view perhaps on all the angles that are required, ranging from national incentives on the one hand, perhaps local infrastructure solutions on the other. What's required in your view?
I think you hit the nail on the head there with that word partnership. I think it does need a partnership. I think it needs a partnership between manufacturers, between national government and local government increasingly have a role to play. So for manufacturers, it's about bringing forward new product offerings that meet the needs of our customers at a commercial point and an attractive proposition. For national government, I think it's about getting the right policy framework, setting really clear direction. So making clear their commitment to net zero and how then they're going to deliver that. And then in terms of local authorities, it's around ensuring that the charging infrastructure locally is there, making sure that the shift towards ultra-low emission vehicles combines with what cities and local authorities are doing around clean air zones. So it is very much about that sense of partnership. We all need to work together to deliver this ambition.
Okay, thank you. And again, similar sort of angle, just to explore this a little bit more. It feels to me that if there was a race down the sort of road to zero that we're on, it doesn't necessarily feel that we're unfortunately at the head of the pack yet. There are other countries probably ahead of us. So what examples have you seen that are probably successful examples from elsewhere that we could potentially apply in the UK? Glenn, are you there?
Was that question addressed to me? I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, if we,
yes, it was.
the typical example is Norway, because we have there an extremely comprehensive set of incentive schemes in place. So you have tax advantages, you have purchase advantages, you have a very thorough charging infrastructure, public and private. You see that if you have that effective mix, and it kind of refers to the 3 points that I was referring to earlier, the right products on the one hand, the right charging infrastructure, broadly accessible, and then also monetary incentives, that the share of electrified driving can really skyrocket. And we have shares of 80-85% of all of the vehicles that we sell in the Norwegian context have a plug. So that, I think that is a shining example of what incentives can really do. However, and we see this in other markets, if you take away the incentives all of a sudden, that quite often the share of electric driving then also goes down as well. So I think it's important that the uptake is comprehensive and thorough. We had recently in Germany a debate in terms of what type of support the automotive industry should be getting. The German government doubled their contribution to a bonus for electrified vehicles. Now for a compact, fully electric vehicle, the level of purchase incentive that you're getting amounts to 9,000 euros, so that you have price parity. And that is, of course, encouraging a lot of consumers to purchase electrified vehicles. However, don't forget the majority of customers still are opting to go for a conventional vehicle. And so I think there still are challenges there, psychological challenges in terms of accessibility to charging infrastructure. So that really needs to be in place. And maybe my final thought to address that question is, in over 90% of the markets where we operate, we have a CO2 fleet regulation that really lays out a long-term target. And we mentioned the 2030 target in Europe. There is no manufacturer that can meet these long-term ambitious targets without increasing the share of electrified vehicles. So from a regulatory standpoint, the road to electric driving has already been defined and has been laid out. The key over the next few years is really the adoption at a national level, at a market level, and that's charging, that's creating the right amount of incentives, that's also customer education, encouraging electric driving. In the case of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, also explaining technology, the potential of technology in electric driving in the vehicles. That's really the key. I think too much incentive, it's a bit like doping. You take it away and then you're confronted with the reality. So it needs to be gradual, thorough, consistent, and sustainable. And like we mentioned on a number of occasions, the uptake is there, but it needs to be thorough and sustainable.
Yeah. Okay, if I can move on a little bit now to the consumer sentiment around ULEVs and so on, and whether there's been a shift in the consumer market over the lockdown period, and the impacts of COVID is a big question out there. And I'll start with a bit of insight from Autotrader. We have around 55 million monthly visits to our platform, so we have a privileged view on what the consumer's thinking and doing. At the start of the year, we found that 3/4 of buyers were now considering an EV for their next car, an alternative vehicle, more precisely. And that's tempting to put us in this sort of sense of optimism that everyone's going to buy one. But unfortunately, 46% also say that cost is a barrier, really, frankly, preventing them from committing to the actual purchase. And although people are more environmentally aware and progressively car buyers want to make a statement in the right direction, the household economics sort of look like they're going to be more and more challenging in the current period. During lockdown, we saw searches for electric vehicles and hybrids in the first phase actually declining quite considerably, much more so than their ICE equivalents. As things at the outlook improved, let's say, they started turning in the right direction, but still not quite as positively as ICE models. And it would appear that there's a slight sort of level of resorting to what you know best and what you trust most, petrol being the preferred choice of the majority of customers out there. But perhaps, Glenn, I could come back to you about this point of pent-up demand for battery electric vehicles, and whether you believe that there is indeed pent-up demand out there that people might even be falling over themselves to buy one of these cars right now?
I think pent-up demand would be maybe going a bit too far, but we are seeing robust demand. And as we have incentive schemes in place in many of our markets, charging infrastructure becoming more accessible, there certainly is more and more demand that's increasing. I think from our perspective, what's important is the power of choice, as we refer to it, giving customers the opportunity to pick the right drivetrain for their driving needs. So that starts with an efficient internal combustion engine. A plug-in hybrid electric vehicle is a good mix, especially for customers that do commuting, inner city driving, or that need one vehicle to address a multiple set of driving requirements, all the way up to full electric driving. So that choice is there, and based on that product portfolio and the availability, we are seeing more and more uptake, more customers that are saying, I'll give it a shot with a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. I'm impressed with the level of electric driving that I can reach, the charging, or customers that are saying, I do predominantly inner city commuting. I can really rely completely on a fully electric vehicle. So there is demand, and it's steady, it's encouraging, and from our perspective, we have said that we're quite committed to reaching the 2020 and 2021 CO2 targets that we have at a European level, despite the crisis. And we wouldn't be able to make that type of a statement if we didn't see that type of demand for electric vehicles out there. And in terms of and that's the real incentive that we have from a supplier side. 2/3 of our improvement in terms of reducing CO2 is through electric mobility, but 1/3 still comes from efficient internal combustion engines. So demand is steady, and electric mobility is happening, and it will continue to improve. That's our conviction.
Great, thank you. With the consumer angle here and asking a little bit more around this point around their level of comfort when it comes to EVs, with charging and cost as particular concerns. But I'm going to give you a double challenge, because we've got a very good question that's come in from, if I can find the name, from Peter Murphy. How do you get consumers into EVs costing thousands more at a time when consumer confidence is plummeting and unemployment rising? Is the optimism about rising EV demand starting in higher income tiers before it trickles down later? What's the typical profile of people buying EVs now? So a double challenge for you, Peter.
Great. Thanks for that. I think a couple of things to pick up on there. One, in terms of on infrastructure, our experience has been that customers want to be able to charge when they need to, but the bulk of charging instants take place at home, and that very quickly becomes just a fact of life, in the same way that we get used to charging our mobile phone, but with the added advantage of you never need to go to a petrol station. In terms of cost, the majority of vehicles, electric vehicles, are bought on a finance package. Today, most vehicles are bought on a finance package. So it's not so much about the ticket price as the monthly cost. And when you take into account the lower running costs, reduced taxation, you find that electric vehicles are a very competitive option for most consumers. And we find that once people switch to electric vehicles, they don't switch back. And I'd like to pick up on a point that Glenn just talked about there, about getting customers into cars. And that's about the consumer experience. Once you experience what it's like to drive an electric car, the smooth and quiet ride, the rapid acceleration, you find that customers have a very high degree of satisfaction with electric vehicles.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And Sascha, if I can turn to you, and let's move on to the theme of new technologies. We don't have time for much more now, but maybe just one or two more questions. But in terms of commercial vehicles, you mentioned new technologies in the video. They're competing for different sort of adoption rates and so on in different types of vehicle. What do you think are the most likely applications? But just going to add in the point, we've got another question here to give you an equally double challenge. There's a gentleman called Eddie Parker who said there's been a focus on EVs but no mention of hydrogen technology. Has the approach been felt to be non-sustainable as a suitable means to provide power?
Yeah, on the first question, so commercial vehicles is extremely complex in terms of missions, in terms of wheelbase, in terms of weight, and it's difficult also to identify a typical customer because it really depends how many miles per year, how many total kilometer is running inside the city, outside. So it's a really complex and vast world. We see, tendentially speaking, in city centers more the same approach like on electric cars. So we have local emissions, we have noise, and we have charging structure, and especially on light commercial vehicles where the storage necessity of the battery are not so high because of low speed and little driving. Basically, the adoption goes towards electric vehicles. On the long haul, as I said, what is the most CO2 consuming? We do not see electric in the next years to be viable, just because the energy demand is so high that we cannot effectively put it into batteries. So we will need fuel cell technology on that one, or we use gas, or we use diesel on these type of missions. And the same is true if you have strong body applications. For example, if you think of the waste industry or cranes, if you have really high energy demand, it gets difficult to substitute it with batteries. So on those missions, we still need fuel, be it fossil, be it gas, or be it hydrogen in the future. The difference between electric and fuel cell from our point of view is definitely one of cost. We tendentially see for strong applications fuel cell to be the better choice, because the cost of the battery is still prohibitive on very, let's say, high load capacities. And the second one is then, if we also consider the recycling, we must understand there is probably an advantage of fuel cell technology towards the battery recycling, if we don't just look at the vehicle consumption, but we look at the overall economic and ecological value of the proposition.
Thank you, Sascha, for that, and lots of interesting subjects to dive into, I'm sure, in emerging technologies. We've got lots of questions here as well. Thank you to all of you, Glenn, Peter, Sascha, for your conversations today. Been fascinating. As you may know, I'll be available to answer further questions in our Ask the Expert, I beg your pardon, session at 11:30, but in the meantime, enjoy another coffee break, and thank you again to our panelists.